really fascinating, which made me think, what was food like in Europe before all these spices came to it? Was it just all bland?
Well, I think you kind of have it backwards.
Dr. Albala, in your book titled Food in Early Modern Europe, Food Through History, you write the following, quote, food became a cardinal concern in explorations of the New World, as well as fundamental element of global trade, unquote. So let's talk about this global trade for food that became a cardinal concern. What foodstuffs came from the New World to the Americas?
Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. We end up thinking sometimes, oh, food goes from Americas to Europe and from
Yeah.
Europe to Americas. It's a lot more complicated. It's actually global in scale, meaning that food
Oh,
goes from Africa to America. It goes from South America to Africa. It goes from Europe to South America. So it goes from Asia to Mexico. I mean, there's all sorts of food trade stuff and stuff basically becomes global after 1492. And keep in mind that Columbus was really trying to find China, right? I mean, he was
yeah,
not trying
yeah,
to discover anything.
yeah.
And ultimately, they did find they found silver eventually in Mexico by the 1520s, but they still were really interested in getting to China. So there was a trade going from Acapulco to Manila. Galleons went across the Pacific. So you find Filipino food is kind of connected to Mexico, weirdly enough, avocados and chocolate and things like that. But the foods that go in every possible direction, I'll just give you a brief catalog. So you think tomatoes, chilies, squash, uh, potatoes from South America, um, all go from Mexico almost everywhere in the world within the first decades of the 16th century. Chili peppers are the most amazing, actually, because if you think of like chili pepper, wait, in Thailand, it comes from Mexico. Yeah. In Sichuan, in Japan,
Wow.
Togarashi, in Africa, the cuisines all over the world that use chili peppers, they come from the Americas, and spread very, very quickly. Paprika in Hungary and in Turkish cuisine. I mean, it's so quick that people don't even realize it as an American thing. Now, what's weird is that Northern Europe, and in much of Southern Europe too, never gets pepper, like never gets chili peppers. Now, is it because they don't like spicy food? And I would argue exactly the opposite. They love hot food. They love ginger. They love pepper. And the Portuguese, who are bringing this stuff directly from Asia, remember, this is the first time there's a direct trade route
Yeah,
from
yeah.
Macau to Lisbon, basically, through lots of different pathways, is that the Portuguese want to protect their monopoly on pepper. They're not going to bring seeds to spread around with chili peppers, which chili peppers you can grow anywhere. Black pepper you cannot. It only grows in the tropics, in
Oh,
Malabar. So they're very careful in not bringing chili to Europe. And that gets there a few places. The Spanish have their smoked paprika. In Sicily, they have chili peppers. But look, this piment d'Espelette in southern France. But you go to the north where they can grow chili peppers, of course. There's nothing. It's just, Germany, England, Scandinavia, northern France, Belgium, Netherlands, Poland, and, across that whole swathe, you just don't find chili peppers at all.
it has to do
Which
with business, monopoly.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a theory. There are many other reasons, but I think primarily people like spicy food, but they want the importers wanted to keep it pepper.
Um,
Um,
I'm
now,
wondering
now,
if you,
having said things go other ways, let me give you a couple of just weird examples. If I were
please,
to ask
please,
you, where do peanuts come from?
Georgia.
You'd think Georgia was a great idea. No. How about before that?
I actually don't know.
You might think Africa.
You
Slaves grew them
makes
there.
makes
That would
makes
be
sense.
close. But
Yeah.
no, they come from South America. They went from South America to the west coast of Africa to Georgia. And there's so many plants like this that make this bizarre crossing and recrossing in so many ways. If I were to say pineapples,
Hawaii.
you might think Hawaii. No, it's the Caribbean. They're brought to Hawaii later, as are macadamia nuts, which come from Australia. They're not. In fact, there's nothing native to Hawaii. No edible food is native to Hawaii. Everything was brought by people.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and fish, but apart from that, nothing. Um,
I want to ask you about this. I want to ask you about potatoes.
okay,
I've read more than one history book in which they've talked about potatoes, how they changed history. They came from Peru. They changed the way armies march. Now they have more. Talk a little bit about that. How? So one, it's true that it came from Peru.
sure. So I mean, there's several books about potatoes. Actually, the
Yeah,
classic is Redford Salomon, and wrote in the 40s. What I think is really the first single subject book on food.
yeah,
The
40s.
social influence of the potato and stuff like that. Well, anyways, potatoes don't catch on in Europe very quickly at all, even though Peru was discovered and settled mid 16th century, 1540s to 60s. Um, Potatoes are known as a sort of botanical curiosity, and they have cousins in Europe in the Solanaceae family that are poisonous. So I think when people looked at these, they thought, we're
Oh,
not eating this stuff. This is, and it's the same with tomatoes. Tomatoes are Solanaceae. Um, and belladonna, is its cousin. So it's atropine is the poison that makes your eyeballs wide, and it kills you eventually if you take too much of it. But in any case, I think people looked at it and said, and this leaves smell bad, and they sort of knew its botanical cousins and thought this can't be food. People started eating them anyway and planting them, and in fact they tasted them too. And interestingly, the dietary authors don't know what to make of potatoes. They think they're like truffles, which suggests to me that they're actually probably pretty small and they're not the big monster russets that we're used to.
yeah, yeah.
And they think they treat them like truffles as an excrement of the earth. Is what they call them. I think that's Thomas Moffat. That's going to be very dangerous, impossible to digest, and of course you shouldn't eat anything like this if you're sensible. Um, and over the centuries, some places planted them, the Irish especially. Places in northern England planted potatoes. And, there are a lot of stories about how people got other people to eat potatoes. There's one completely ridiculous apocryphal story. I think it's Frederick the Great wanted to encourage potato eating, and so he planted a
So this is
garden.
Germany.
Yes, planted a garden with them, and or it's Prussia actually. Planted a garden and put guards around it, so people would pay attention, thinking, "Ooh, there must be something really special there." And then at night, when the guards left, the people came and stole the potatoes and ate them and said, "These are really good." I don't think it's true. Parmentier is true though. The August, I thought, is it August Parmentier? Anyway, Parmentier was the guy who promoted potatoes in 18th century France to Louis XIV. Louis XIV wore a little potato blossom in his lapel to sort of honor what Parmentier was doing. But Parmentier tried to extend bread with potato flour, which he certainly can do, and promoted it after the revolution as a very particularly Republican, egalitarian food because it was inexpensive and you wouldn't have famine. You wouldn't depend
Highly
on
nutritional.
wheat prices. And it is neutral, of course. Yeah, totally. It's
Yeah.
great for you.
Um, we're talking about spices and it's global trade. Spices in Thailand come from Mexico and even going back. It's really fascinating, which makes me think, what was food like in Europe before all these spices came to it? Was it just all bland?
Well, I think you kind of have it backwards. The
Oh,
spices are there most of the time in recorded history. It's People loved spices in ancient Rome. They adored, they had slightly different. They loved pepper. They loved ginger. They loved silphium, which is probably an extinct plant. By legend, it goes extinct. But they liked really spicy, sweet, sour. They loved fish sauce. So the highly seasoned food is there from the very earliest cookbooks. And it remains in place all the way up through the Renaissance. Food is still very heavily spiced and sweetened. They loved sugar on everything. So you have a bowl of pasta. There's no tomato sauce, of course. There's probably cinnamon and sugar and butter on it, which is delicious, mind you. Nothing wrong with that at
cinnamon in a
all.
bowl of pasta. Okay.
Oh yeah, and sugar, totally. It's
I
fantastic.
have to try that now.
And
Okay.
Take that same mixture, sprinkle it on a roast chicken someday, and see how happy it will become. It's great.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so anyway, food is very, very heavily spiced up until about the 17th century, mid 17th century. Supposedly, La Varenne is the one who initiates all this, and he basically banishes most of the spices. Some disappear entirely. I mean, cardamom goes out of cooking, long pepper, cubebs, grains of paradise, galangal. Those were very common spices in late Middle Ages. By the 17th century, they either get removed from the main courses, as does sugar, or they get banished to the very end of the meal. So you'd find spice sometimes a little at the end, and you might find a little remnant, a little grating of nutmeg in something, or cloves stuck into an onion. But it's not this complex mixture of many spices, more reminiscent of Indian cooking, really. I mean, that's what
Um,
it seems closest to me.
can we go back to what you just shared with us? Two questions. One, why were spices banned? And how did, who had this authority to do this?
Well, no, they weren't banned. They go
Okay.
out of fashion. There's a very big difference. So
Okay.
so
Okay. Let's talk about
the
that. Yeah.
spices, there's a couple of reasons. One is that the humoral theory, which recommends spices as correctives for food, starts to break down. I think that's very important. Two, the Portuguese, who are now bringing spices into Europe in great numbers, they don't lower the cost, but they're ubiquitous. Anyone can buy spices now. What do you suppose that does to elite people who are trying to show off by having lots of spice on their food?
You're no
No big
longer,
deal anymore. Yeah, it's no big, if everyone's driving around in a Cadillac, you need a Lamborghini, right? So, and I think also the spices, they go out of fashion because people start thinking food should taste like itself. That's a major culinary shift from something that I've coined a phrase which I hope catches on, called polysavory, meaning lots of different flavors: sweet, sour, bitter, hot, salty, umami, whatever, all mixed together, which most cuisines on earth are still that way. And the European flavor profile changes to, here's a piece of protein, the sauce is made of that same thing. So a gravy on a roast, a chicken sauce made of chicken stock that goes on it, fish sauce made of fish, and that the flavors should not be jarring or
some people do that with
polysavory.
Thanksgiving turkey, like use the juices and everything to
Yeah,
flavor the
well,
turkey.
anything, any classic
Yeah.
French cooking,
Um,
you make stocks and fondants based on the main ingredient so that the flavors harmonize. And so intense acids are banished, sweetness is banished to the end of the meal, and you just don't find all those spices, those complex, combinations of spice that ultimately come from the Middle East, really, Middle Eastern cooking. And I think, like most fashions, there's exceptions everywhere. Some people linger on. The Italians actually hold on to this stuff through the 17th century, but the French set fashion in language and clothes and architecture, and everyone looks at what the French are doing and they say, oh, this is a new cuisine. It's lighter, it's healthier, it's better for you. It's all sorts of and it's presented in a different way. Instead of having this enormous array of foods plopped on the table at once, everyone gets their own plate by the end of the 18th century. And it's just a different way of thinking about food.
you said sweetness is banished to the end of the meal. Are we talking about dessert now? That's where dessert comes
Right,
from.
right.
That
Well,
is
dessert
fascinating.
literally means dessert and desert are the same word. It means to empty, to clear the table. Everything gets taken away, and then you bring on the final meal course.
Oh, I never thought of it that way. That is, wow, that's really interesting. Um, I wanted to speak with you about the spice business, but I think you already answered the question that I had. I wanted to talk about what happens, why this becomes a big business. And you corrected me, Citadel, you had it backwards. The spices did exist in Europe. So perhaps the reason why the spice route and all this business took off, it's not so much that they were not available in Europe. It's rather that they could now be made into a humongous business. Commoners could have it. It's not just a king anymore.
Right.
Interesting. Okay.
So spices are imported, in ancient times into Europe. That trade doesn't completely disappear, but it really dries up a lot from the fall of the Roman Empire all the way up through about 10th, 11th century. They're still getting some pepper, things, but it's very rare. It's not all over the cuisine. And then through the Middle Ages, the interest in spices keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. And this is, of course, why Columbus wanted to get to China.
Yeah.
Spice trade, direct route, trade route. It's why the Portuguese did go to China ultimately, and Japan and Indonesia and India, the reason that people like spices so much, I think, is one of those bugbears of food history. In fact, probably the most notorious of all is this idea that people use spices to cover up the aroma, the odor of rotting meat. If you can afford spices, you can afford fresh meat. I mean, that's just
I love that.
No one in their right mind would take rotting meat and put something really, really expensive on it. You're going to buy fresh meat. And B, you can't eat rotting meat. I'm sorry, you get sick from it. Everyone would have in the past, as we do today.
But you often see that in movies or whatever.
They repeat it because they want to believe it, but it's complete nonsense. The real reason is to show off. It might be a little bit medicinal. It might be, something exotic and to stand out. And, because food is basically boring unless you put some exciting spices on it and stuff.
Yeah,
right?
presentation. That's how the French presentation, and also spicing it up. Otherwise, it is boring. Let's take a break here. We'll be back after a short break to talk about recipes from history.